You wake up before the sun, and the first thing you taste is sand. Not a lot. Just a little grit between your teeth, from the bread you're chewing. It's dawn on the Nile, somewhere around 1300 BC, and breakfast is exactly what it was yesterday, and exactly what it'll be tomorrow. Bread and beer. That's it. That's the meal. And here's the strange part. That simple, gritty, repetitive diet might have kept you healthier than whatever you ate this morning. So let's actually sit down at the table. Not the golden banquet of a pharaoh. You've seen that in every museum. Let's eat like a regular person. A farmer, a builder, a mother of four. Because what an ordinary Egyptian put in their mouth every single day tells you more about them than any tomb painting ever will. Start with the bread because everything starts with the bread. Egyptians didn't just eat bread. They ran on it. They were paid in it. Your wages for a day of hauling stone or working a field might literally be a stack of loaves and a few jugs of beer. Bread was money. Bread was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it came from a grain most people today have never heard of. Emmer wheat, a tough, ancient ancestor of the wheat in your kitchen. Now that grit you're tasting? That's not an accident. To turn emmer into flour, you grind it between two stones, hour after hour, and tiny fragments of stone and desert sand end up in the flour. Every loaf carries a little bit of the grinding stone inside it. And over a lifetime, that sand does something brutal. It files your teeth down. The people who study Egyptian remains find the same thing again and again. Teeth worn almost flat, sometimes ground right down to the nerve, even in people who died young. Not from candy, not from decay, from bread. The very thing keeping you alive was quietly sanding away your smile. Which brings us to the drink washing it all down. Beer. And I need you to forget everything the word beer means to you now. This wasn't a cold thing you cracked open at the end of the day. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, a little sour, closer to a lumpy porridge you could drink than anything on a shelf today. It was made from the same grain as the bread, barely fermented, low in alcohol, and packed with calories. Everyone drank it. Workers, elders, children. It was safer than a lot of standing water, it filled your stomach, and it was basically liquid food. When the workers who built the pyramids were handed their rations, this is what they got. Bread and beer, the two halves of the same grain, feeding the greatest construction project in the ancient world. So already you can see it. This isn't a diet of luxury. It's a diet of fuel. But it's not just grain, and this is where it gets good. Because right next to the bread, on almost every table in Egypt, there was the onion. Onions, garlic, leeks. Egyptians loved them. Raw onions with bread was a genuine meal, the kind of thing a laborer ate in the shade at midday. Garlic was valued enough to be handed out to keep workers strong. These weren't side dishes. For a poor family, an onion and a piece of bread was lunch, and nobody thought that was sad. It was just food. And around that core, the Nile filled in the rest. You had lettuce, tall, thin romaine, considered a little bit special, cucumbers, radishes, celery, beans and lentils and chickpeas, which gave you the protein that meat couldn't, because meat for most people was rare. And then the fruit, which was the closest thing you had to a treat. Figs, dates, grapes, fresh or dried into raisins. Pomegranates, if you were lucky. Melons in the heat. Here's something worth stopping on. There was no sugar, none. The stuff pouring into nearly everything you eat today simply did not exist here. So where did sweetness come from? Two places. Dates, which are so sweet they're almost sticky, and honey. Real golden honey, kept in hives and painted on tomb walls, prized enough that it was used as medicine, as an offering to the gods, and as the one true luxury on a sweet-tooth's table. And that little detail hides one of the most human things about ancient Egypt. Because the rich, the people who could afford all the honey and the honeyed cakes they wanted, their teeth rotted. Cavities. Decay. The classic sugar problem. 3,000 years before a candy bar existed. While the poor wore their teeth down with grit, the wealthy melted theirs away with sweetness. Sit with that for a second. Two versions of the same broken smile. One from working too hard for plain bread, one from having too much of the good stuff. If that sounds a little familiar, if that sounds like a divide you could describe today without changing a word, that's the point. We didn't invent that story. We just kept telling it. Okay, let's talk about the thing you're probably waiting for. Meat. For most Egyptians, meat was not an everyday food. Beef, especially, was expensive. Cattle were wealth on legs, and a slab of roast beef was a rich person's dinner or a festival treat, not a Tuesday. If you were a normal family, you tasted beef a handful of times a year, if that. But you were not going without protein, because you lived next to one of the most generous rivers on earth. The Nile was a market that never closed. Tilapia, catfish, mullet, perch. Fish was the meat of the common people. You caught it, you salted it, you dried it in the hard sun so it would keep, and it fed families up and down the river. And above the water, the marshes were full of birds. Ducks, geese, pigeons, netted and trapped and roasted. For a lot of people, a fat duck was a far more realistic celebration than a cow ever would be. And here's where the pyramid builders come back into the story. Because for years, people assumed the men who raised those stones were starving slaves, fed scraps. Then, archaeologists dug up the town where they actually lived, right beside Giza, and found something else entirely. They found bakeries running at an enormous scale. They found the bones of thousands of cattle and sheep and goats. These workers were being fed meat, real meat, and a lot of it hauled in from farms across the country to keep them strong. Think about what that means. The people doing the hardest physical work in the ancient world were fed better than the average farmer back home. A society that wanted its greatest monument built understood, without any nutrition science at all, that you cannot build something enormous on empty stomachs. How you feed the people doing the heavy lifting says everything about what you're trying to build. That was true on the Giza Plateau. It's true in every workplace you've ever walked into. So put the whole plate together now. Here's the day. You wake up to bread and beer. At midday, in the shade, you tear into more bread with a raw onion, maybe some dried fish. In the evening, if it's a good day, there are beans, a little fish or fowl, some figs, and always, always more beer. Grain, vegetables, fish, fruit, almost no sugar, almost no red meat, a huge amount of fiber. And a doctor today would look at that plate and quietly nod. Because that, minus the sand, is close to the kind of diet people now pay a lot of money and read a lot of books trying to get back to. That's the strange gift buried in all of this. You and this Egyptian farmer are separated by more than 3,000 years, by pyramids and pharaohs, and a language written in pictures. But you're chasing something they already had by accident. They ate real food, close to the ground it grew from, because they had no other choice. You have every choice in the world, endless variety, a fridge that would look like a treasure hoard to them, and a lot of us are trying to eat our way back to the simplicity they were born into. They weren't eating clean. They didn't have a word for it. They were just eating what the river and the field could give, over and over, day after identical day. And maybe that's the last thing to notice. The sameness. You ate the same meal today that you ate yesterday and will eat tomorrow, and it never once occurred to you to be bored by it, because food wasn't entertainment. It was survival and community, and the rhythm of being alive next to a river that fed everyone the same bread. So the next time you stand in front of a full pantry, unable to decide, a little tired of everything in it, think of the Egyptian, chewing that gritty loaf at dawn, tasting the sand, and never once wondering what else there could be. They built a civilization on bread and beer and onions. And they might have felt a lot less hungry than you do,